The facilitators for the groups, we have Professor Mitchell. For Group 1, identification of gaps, capacity and development needs, and resource challenges. We have Group 2, Keith Ford from UNOCHA, looking at regulatory framework, including building codes, standards, zoning, and physical planning issues. Group 3, Karima Akins-Mitchell of ODPEM, looking at critical facilities, lifeline systems, and vital infrastructure resilience. Group 4, Michelle Edwards. Michelle, raise your hand, please. Thank you. Also of ODPEM, looking at governance, institutional issues, roles and responsibilities, public and private sector partnership building. And Group 5, awareness building, sensitization and communication, Delmaris White, also of ODPEM. And the Group 5, as I said, would meet outside. We need to identify a rapporteur for each group to support the convener, and we would also like a supporting note taker. So please be prepared to volunteer and to participate. We're not going to name you, but the conveners of the groups will help to prod you along. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Mr. MacDonald to just do a quick recap, and then we will move quickly into the working groups. We do have a tight morning. We expect the working groups to finish for you to go to a coffee break, and then after the coffee break to come back where each of the conveners will do a very brief summary of the group. Mr. MacDonald will then try to pull the 1.5 days together to plan the way forward for us, and then we're going to have a very short closing ceremony. The Minister of Water, Land, Environment and Climate Change, who has responsibility for the spatial planning, development approval process, and so on, will join us. Yesterday, Minister Arscott joined us, and the Res Rep of UNDP will also be here, and ODPEM's ODPEM's Director General, Acting Director General, will also join us. We expect to finish before lunch so that we will release you so that you are free to leave and have your lunch. So we are expecting a very tight morning. Okay? Thank you very much. Mr. MacDonald, please.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Good morning, everyone. My task is really not so much to summarize, as just maybe quickly run you through what had happened yesterday, because I found it extremely informative. I thought I knew the subject fairly well, but all through the day, information, some disturbing, but good information based on sound analysis was being presented. And I think this is part of the reason that this ODPEM and the UN system together pull this whole initiative. We are now wrapping up together. As you will recall, we began the working sessions with a quick scan, very ably led by Professor Mitchell, of just what the tectonic situation is as we understand it based on today's science, and it's still an emerging comprehension. And I think we also got an idea of some of the emerging findings and some of the gaps we need to fill in terms of additional investment in the acquisition of information, etc. I'm not going to try to keep this in order. I'm just going to make the point that in the national presentations which came in session 2, I was struck throughout the presentations, and I think particularly in the case of the Mexican presentation, by the very clear statements, and this is not to say the others didn't include that, in terms of the investments they are making in the platforms to collect information, number one, and the effort that they are putting in to make sure that the information which is being collected on the public's behalf is being fed back into the public. So I think that really was, for me, one of the high points of the practice from other places. Just going through, we then had a information on the review of what a 1907 event would have done to Jamaica roughly at this time, And I don't want to repeat what Mr. Mason so ably said, but the important points I want to remind you of in that presentation was that 1907 is not the extreme event for Jamaica, either historically or in terms of the scenarios now being evolved. And it would seem that Jamaica can experience a 7 to 7.2. 1907 was somewhere between 6 and 6.5. So we need to keep that in our minds. And number two, the draping over the Jamaican economy of 2007, of 1907, was done without the benefit of some of the newer computer-based tools and techniques. And in a discussion last night at the ResReps, which we are very grateful, madam, you can pass it on, several people pointed out that more detailed computer data sets for the buildings and for the geological setting of Kingston now exist. And those, we need to improve those scenarios by running them through the more currently available information and continue that work. Very important, and should be factored in to whatever we plan going forward. The presentations by Ms. Chambers and Ms. Atkins Mitchell and Ms. Edwards from the ODPEM and on behalf of the Red Cross, I think all pointed out that some analyses have been done which go beyond just the scientific and technical into the systems and organizational arrangements, and it's very obvious that there are things that need to be addressed. The state of the fire, police, health facilities was for me a bit of a shocking surprise, and lots of questions come into my mind which the group may want to write down as issues to be addressed, which include whether, having arrived at those conclusions, alternative methods of carrying out those services in the case of an emergency have been evolved, number one, and number two, whether retrofitting was being attempted. And I want to just waste some of your time by pointing out I drew Professor Krimgle quickly through the Ministry of Education compound and race course. So we have known since the late 70s that buildings like that with a soft bottom floor do not do well in earthquakes. We have known that as a fact. That building has never been retrofitted. It's a Ministry of Education head office. I speak openly because we're in an open public matter, but in 30 years since that building has been recognized as a problem, if you remember the building, it's a medium-story building with parking on the ground floor. Those buildings, since the California earthquake of 1973, have been uniformly recognized as not being a good idea. So we need to address the issue why the government building system allows police stations, etc., to continue to exist in unsafe situations, and why even a ministry headquarters can continue in that state. And this is already, I'm saying it openly because this is not a secret discussion. So we have an issue with that kind of acceptance of knowledge and taking practical action. The second session, as you will recall, brought us some wonderful examples of current practice, lessons learned, etc. I won't attempt to repeat them. And what I think I would like to say is that part of our follow-up must be to try to see what kinds of linkages and partnerships we can build to continue to learn from our colleagues in other countries and to try to make sure that we don't have to wait till we experience an event to begin the learning process. And the final session brought you some examples of resilience in practice from Digicel. Professor Krimgle brought some examples of the interaction between systems, and I only need to remind you of wonderful examples of lack of interaction between agencies. The Palisades Road was recently fixed, and then we find it's being dug up to put back in conduits for a service, to recognize that we have a problem of that nature in Jamaica, and that we need to reflect on how, I think he presented you in terms of a municipal urban management framework in a foreign jurisdiction in the United States. We need to put our minds around how we can bring about better coordination of both routine things between the agencies. That's a big challenge which I think we're recognizing here, and probably we need to reflect on it. Out of the presentations in the last session, I just want to point to that again. What came to me in terms of a systems reaction is if PAHO can do that kind of screening for the hospitals, is someone doing that for the schools? And to remind you that in the case of Pakistan and China, in recent earthquakes in the last decade, a significant part of the casualties were children in schools. We don't want that to happen to Jamaican children. But it means that somebody needs to get on with the Safe Schools program in Jamaica. And we also probably, in reflecting on digital, to see what we can do to facilitate the equivalent of the South-South cooperation, which has been mentioned between countries, that we need to find some intersectoral coordination modalities. So advanced and progressive countries like Digicel, Grace, etc., who have had long-standing resilience plans, the GLEAN itself, operate within a private sector where some other companies don't have plans and systems which are as advanced. So the idea of this forum is partly to make sure that in addition to tweaking the interests of the public sector, we look very hard at what kind of civil society and private sector exchanges we also need to promote and look at in the wrap-up sessions. The working groups have some questions laid out which we hope will stimulate discussion in that area. We have added sensitization, public awareness, etc., communication as a separate one, because it seemed to us that coming out of every one of the discussions was a certain amount of need. So we are asking all the groups to consider under their theme what are the awareness building needs, and then we will have a separate group of public awareness specialists, if you will, looking at this, because it seems that is a common theme, cross-cutting theme, not the only one, but that one we'll tackle. Before I allow the groups to go ahead, I just want to point out, remind you that the idea of this forum is that this is an event which is contributing to a process. The process has already begun. You've heard all the facts that are available. We need to harmonize and rationalize it. And it seems to me we need to look very carefully at issues of better communication and coordination, and then more discrete actions in terms of making sure that the best practices we heard described actually are systematically applied, and we have some measurement that January next year, hopefully we won't have any big events between now and then, we can come back here and show concrete progress. I just want to point out that, not that I'm a cynic, but I do have on the table enough copies of a newspaper headline of April 1983, which reads, "Building Code for Jamaica," in which the Prime Minister of the day promised that within that calendar year we would have the building code. So we have enough copies to go around. It's from a newspaper which long died, the Daily News, and it quotes the highest authority in the land promising us something which we heard promised again on March 31, 2014. I am an optimist, but I just want to point out that one of the reasons the civil society and private sector need to engage on this is that we need to also have the tide of public opinion go with making some of these things happen. So you are going to have a very tight working group arrangement, and I'm going to turn you back over to Margaret to get that started. Sorry, one other thing. We do have some of the copies of the Collier report. Yesterday some people came and said that they did see parts of it. So I think we have about 20 copies here for those people who would wish a copy. And we will have extracts of the report's recommendations available in each working group.
Thank you very much, Mr. MacDonald. Okay, we need to move right into the working sessions. So conveners, group 1 over here, just follow Professor Mitchell. If you didn't sign up yesterday, please do sign up. If you have identified a group that you want to participate in, go and join, and we'll ensure that the rapporteurs record who is in the group. Group 2 at the far back, my left of the room, Keith Ford. Group 3 at the far back right, that's Karima Akins Mitchell. Group 4 at the front right,
I'm Diego Varela from the Chilean International Cooperation Agency.
I'm Korea from the National Emergency Office.
Okay. From what?
No, the earthquake rescue.
The geological service? The earthquake unit, that is
Private.
Facilities and systems which are socially, economically, or operationally essential to the functioning of society. And so on included in this but that was just for context setting. And we're going to be looking at critically in relation to Jamaica, not just maintenance and the first is for us to identify the critical gaps in Jamaica.
Just if we have any comments, is there a time we should
No,
put
it's
it
a
to?
start
Okay, well, as far as definition of critical facilities, the building codes, I mean, as engineering designers, they are already pointed out. So,
So I think you're still referring that by March 31st, we should have had an approved building or framework to
that will promote the strengthening of the regulatory system and can be affordable than whatever is proposed in terms of cost to consumers of existing buildings. I'm not sure if we'll be able to take that on now, but she felt strongly that, again, a number of the prefab buildings can get to that. So it's a full plate that we need to address. I'm going to ask Mr. Wilson, being from local government, if you can just give us a synopsis of the regulatory system as it now exists, and then anyone else who wishes to speak up.
When I read regulatory framework and building code, I saw the building code as one aspect of
It's
the
one aspect.
regulatory system. So coming out of yesterday, there were some other questions I had about the regulatory environment. I'm not sure how much we can address.
Yeah, well, that's what Mr. Wilson is with local government. So if he can address, and let's look at the gaps. What are the actions necessary for specific areas and the resources also? If we decide we're going to focus on
Sort of in a situation where we're dealing with, putting together the scientific groundwork which we're going to use to, at the end of the day, hopefully make Jamaica a safer place in terms of into that. It's very difficult for anything else to be done. So yes, obviously that feeds into the NICA is not just going to increase the funding, but I think one of the key things is looking for partners elsewhere who want to share the cost. For instance, things like when we're talking about tsunami networks. Tsunami networks work on the basis of having a set of equipment across the whole region, and therefore you've got partners elsewhere who want to see them run.
I am going to hand over to the facilitators for this session, Mr. Franklin McDonald, our technical advisor, and Dr. Elsie Laurent Chanoun, UNDP Deputy Resident Representative. Welcome, Dr. Laurent Chanoun. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will go right into the plenary with the presentation from the working groups.
I'm Elsie Laurent Chanoun. I'm the Deputy Representative. Good afternoon, everyone. No, it's the morning. It's 10 minutes to afternoon. All right. We are almost at the end of a very fruitful and interesting forum, I believe. Much has been exchanged and said over the past day and a half, and there was an excellent knowledge sharing and experience learned, either from the experts who came from abroad or, amongst ourselves as experts. And I believe all this will contribute to increasing awareness and seismic risk preparedness in Jamaica. In this morning's session, we had several working groups reflecting on critical and key areas. The discussions were very lively and excellent recommendations will be shared with you very soon. The overall key outcomes of the different sessions, together with the recommendations of the working groups, will form the basis of a roadmap for improving seismic preparedness in Jamaica. Now, without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Franklin McDonald. Franklin? Yeah, you want to wait. Who is going to facilitate the presentation of the working groups. There were five working groups. So we're going to give approximately 15 minutes to each working groups to present their findings.
Okay, well, we had a lively discussion thinking about a number of things. I will go through them relatively quickly because we thought about lots of things. Whether they were all in our remit, I don't know. The first thing we started with was the data collection aspect of things, and something which is obviously very close to me at the moment, and that is we at the moment don't have a seismologist at the earthquake unit, and that obviously is a significant gap. And we felt that we needed to put something in place, or have something in place, which would actually work along the lines of making sure we had a transition in that route. And we thought that we might move towards a situation where we would have two seismologists, one who would be a head seismologist, one who would be a junior one, learning the ropes, so that if one of the seismologists leaves, we've still got somebody else in place, and we can continue on actually with what we're doing. And I think that it would be an important move forward. That was a general discussion on that, and I think everybody was agreed with that. Obviously, there's a funding aspect that comes to that as well. And we would have to consider how that could be possibly funded, as the one position for the seismologist is funded by the Jamaican government. We also looked at the other sort of aspects of equipment and requiring funding for equipment and these sort of things, and felt that all of these things were very important, and we should not really be developing any gaps or omissions with our seismic network in Jamaica. Our next thing we went on to think about, having informed expertise in our group, was the insurance costs, and thinking about insurance aspects in Jamaica with regard to property. And it was suggested that current insurance for residents was at the rate of less than 10%. For commercial buildings, about 50%. Okay, so if there was a significant earthquake which caused a lot of damage, there would be a very large number of buildings which were not insured. Equally on top of it, insurance companies are required to keep 15% of the coverage they have for payments to go out. So if the actual damage exceeded 15% of the insurance, there would be a shortfall in availability of money. So these are some of the issues that obviously would be of serious effect to Jamaica. We looked at the nature of response, who coordinates if the response facilities break down. So in other words, if we have a problem with losing key personnel, how do we maintain a response, an active response, at a time of something like an earthquake? We then moved on to the idea of the importance of key locations and identifying locations should those become problematic. And obviously some of the key ones that come to note are airports. The airports in Jamaica are generally on the low, flat ground, where we're likely to see potential problems from liquefaction or just failure into the sea, which would mean that there would be potentially significant problems with actually landing any aid that was required into the country. So there needs to be identified appropriate areas, a number of those appropriate areas which could act if that was the case. So large open areas close to the major cities, major built-up areas would be important. Obviously, other key locations include things that we heard about before, things like hospitals, healthcare facilities, etc., etc. We also looked at the other buildings such as penal institutions, prisons and such like, which are in a difficult position because the occupants are likely to be restrained. The buildings are generally of low quality, and during an earthquake they're likely to collapse with very large amounts of loss of life. So there would be a significant implication there, certainly in terms of human rights. We moved on to other things, things like banking and particularly electronic banking. Should an earthquake come suddenly, people aren't going to have any cash available. I mean, when a hurricane comes, you've got a warning time. Everybody goes and gets out there however much money they deem that they will need for the immediate foreseeable future. With an earthquake, a serious earthquake, obviously the time frame might be much longer in terms of how long you're going to need money, but the time to get it is nothing, zero. So how do you continue functioning if you lose all electronic banking? And in terms of functioning, we also thought about communications and how we actually communicate both in Jamaica and with the outside world. And most of our communications to the outside world are by underwater cable. And obviously one of the significant problems with an earthquake is it generates submarine landslides which can destroy those cables. So if we had a severe earthquake, it's quite possible we could be cut off from the outside world by things like the internet. Okay, we no longer have direct satellite communications, as far as I understand it, in terms of a dish that sends internet. So that, again, will be another significant issue. I think that concludes what our group discussed. Yeah, I think so. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Group 2 looked at the regulatory framework, and we subsumed under this the various acts, the building codes, planning regulations, etc. We started off with an overview of the system by Mr. Wilson from local government, and he indicated that the act, when it comes on stream, it will repeal some of the existing regulations, such as the KCC Act. The Parish Council Building Act will also be repealed. The Building Act will be administered through the parish councils, the local authorities, and this will gain formal recognition, we hope, in March of this year after presentation to Cabinet. We identified a number of gaps in terms of the application of the Act, and these all relate to enforcement, and I think we could put enforcement as the heading and subsume all of these below. One is the non-professional involvement in the design of buildings. It was indicated that a significant number of structures are being designed by draftsmen who are not licensed. The issue of monitoring enforcement, which we'll come back to. Staffing levels and numbers at the parish council. For example, it was indicated that St. Catherine, I believe, has 2 building officers, and there's a need for more. The cost of transition, example, the need for a small building code or a building code that focuses on small structures, the informal structures. How do we get these up to speed so that they can withstand the disasters that we're prone to? The cost of the IBC was mentioned. I think that entire packet is some $200,000 for the packet. We also looked at information and training as one of the gaps. Corruption, and this would be exacerbated by the lack of clarity or discretion based on the system where building inspectors are given some leeway. It would also be exacerbated by the bureaucracy of the framework. We looked at the ability of the country to test building materials and building systems. This was not in place at the moment. Okay, the preponderance of informal structures, informal or unplanned settlement was looked at, and in terms of the resilience of these buildings. It was mentioned also about the regulation governing the use of buildings. Buildings were not being properly used for what they were designed for, and so you have storage of chemicals, of gases, of other hazardous materials in these buildings, and this needs to be looked at. Staffing and modernization of all the agencies, specifically local government, the parish councils, was seen also as a gap. Okay, we decided to look at, pull a number of these areas out to focus on them, and training was one. It was mentioned that the training needs were being identified, and there's a need for certifying the standardized, certifying or having a standardized training program, reviewing of the curricula, and under the building code, there will be the establishment of a certification board that would look at the credentials of persons being involved in the construction industry. Training will involve persons from local government, building inspectors, the professionals, draftsmen, and artisans. And we'll look at this in a little more detail. Testing, the other area we looked at, and there was a need to identify resources within the government for the establishment of a testing lab in Jamaica. And this could be done through private-public partnership, working in conjunction with UTEC. It was also discussed that this could be part of the undertaking research projects. The need for a simulator was also identified. And UTEC basically, as part of the training, this could be incorporated in the UTEC training curricula, because they would train at all levels for the government. And it was also identified that we needed to train a surplus of persons, so that if they're not on staff at the parish council level, they could be contracted to work for the parish council. So this would be done on a contractual basis, since the staff complement tends to be fixed, but if you can contract others, but they would have to meet the necessary requirements. Public information was the third area looked at, and this should be public information aimed not only at the general public, but also members of the parish council, representatives at the parish council, that it had to be a broad-based training program that had to be looked at. Now, staffing and modernization was one that we briefly looked at, but in the break, I had a brief discussion with a number of persons who are involved in this, and they pointed out that this is going to be the make or break of the entire enforcement system, because as they pointed out, the building code is due to come on stream in March, and this is a more complicated code than now exists. Compliance certificates will have to be issued at different points within the construction process, followed by an occupancy certificate. Currently, there are 4 development orders that are to be promulgated. There's a spatial plan, local sustainable plan, the Disaster Act, that all will come on stream within a short time. And these are all to be monitored by the same 2 persons within each parish council. So in terms of staff capacity to undertake the full enforcement of the various laws and regulations, they will be fairly stretched. Basically, this is where our discussion ended. So these were the areas we looked at. We identified 7 gaps, but we basically only had time to focus on 4.
As I understand it, based on the discussion here, many people, the informal persons, don't actually go and seek approval for building. So how are you going to get those into the whole approval process and certification process if they just decide that they want to build something and just build it?
Okay, I think this is, again, one of the areas that we're looking at the capacity of the Parish Council, because if the Parish Council officers identify buildings going up, then they should be able to report on these. But if they are not being reported on, yes, some will fall through the cracks, but we're hoping that under the modernization program, there will be sufficient staff to do effective monitoring. Also, as was pointed out by UTEC, the process of training is being done at 2 levels. In that UTEC will train the professional and HART will train the artisans, who we hope will then take on the task of informing persons that they need to go through the regularized system to get their buildings approved. One training workshop was actually done, and I think UTEC received assurance that, that this process will continue.
Thanks, Keith. That's fine, Keith. I think we're ready to go to the next. I just want to make a point that issues like the one just raised, where we're dealing with how to develop a culture of compliance, we're going to kick the can down to the last presenting group, which is the public awareness sensitization issue, because that requires a shift, where the public who is seeing all of these things must see the need to ensure that the new structures conform to some kind of reasonable standard. So I'm going to kick that one down to the last group and ask for that.
So,
quick one, please.
Yeah, quick one. Okay, I forgot. We also mentioned that was an archival of data, buildings that have been built years ago, such as the National Stadium and others. Where can we go to access information in terms of the standards they were built to? And other buildings, if we're looking at retrofit, how do we access information on those buildings? Is there a central location we can go for those plans?
Thanks, Keith. The issue of the safety of the current building stock is one which is right in the middle of the road. We're trying to put the roadmap to guide us through, because that's a real challenge. But we need to move on. So Michelle Edwards will now. Sorry, I keep on mixing up your group 3 will be presenting. Are you presenting Karim? So Atkins, Michelle will now present on behalf of the group.
A couple of gaps were identified. In looking at critical facilities, you not only look at the structure itself, but you also look at the content, including personnel. And so a gap that was identified is that even if the structure itself remains, the capacity in terms of equipment to respond would be an issue. And so equipment, as well as the facility itself, is a gap. Also the issue of access. So if the facility stands, how do you get to it? So a system of prioritization in terms of creating road access needs to be created. In addition, access width is currently an issue for especially some of the fire trucks. Some of our roadways are a bit narrow, not wide enough to facilitate access from some of these equipment, and so that needs to be rectified in the pre-phase before it becomes an additional complex matter in the response phase. The critical issue of what if the facilities fail? Business continuity planning or continuity of operations plan becomes a major response to that in terms of contingency planning. And so it is felt that all critical facilities should have a continuity of operations plan in place that says if I fail, if I stand, if I have little or some or all of my resources, what do I do? That is currently not in place for many of the facilities we have. There are facilities, critical facilities, and there are critical facilities, which are more important, because clearly you can't address all or prioritize all right now. So you have to have a system of prioritizing even within this critical umbrella of list of facilities. Also interdependencies, and there's a link between business continuity planning and the issue of interdependency. What if a facility goes down? Are there other facilities that may not be deemed critical but becomes critical now because by virtue of the contingency plans in place, it says, I now fade over to you. How do you deal with those interdependencies? The issue of defining critical facilities, while we're generally comfortable with a very broad definition of critical facilities, once you begin to start naming them by name, there's no problem. What we're seeing emerging is the need to include non-traditional facilities among that list. Remittance services came up, very important for recovery. The nursing homes, not normally included. Mass communication and media, maybe your networks, although normally there you have to look at them with a different lens. You get perhaps your Twitter, your things that need to, I hear that is helping. I don't know if I'm so converted yet. But the post offices too. But what is clear is that you now need to put on a different lens when you begin to list these specific facilities to include some of what is non-traditional. The banks, for example, when you need cash in your early recovery processes, are they going to stand up? Some of the short-term solutions, we did look at a system of assessment. The RVS that was presented yesterday, there is need to perhaps look at it a little more, perhaps refining it. Looking at how we transition from the rapid to the detailed, do we need to be making changes in how we even define some of the facilities or as pass or fail? And also critical to the assessment process is not just the facility itself, but as a tool for advocacy, you begin to now put dollar values to the loss, which will cover the loss from the direct plant itself, plus from the indirect consequences such as loss of operation, inability to service, a particular area. What does that translate to in terms of dollar value? Development test VCB, very critical, including your simulations, your drills, and so on. I think that is understood. Especially the issue of interdependencies, because if you depend on my resource, I also equally need to be prepared and to continue to operate to support you in the response phase. A very ticklish issue emerged in that enforcement, but it was felt that government generally tends to break its own rules and not include itself under the enforcement umbrella. So government now needs to enforce government. And so a lot of the critical facilities sometimes are not necessarily given the same level of robust treatment as you would say a commercial development or a large-scale private investment. So government also needs to be enforcing against itself, especially for the critical facilities. I have an area here that is underlined, and Mr. Franklin, I must convey the dissatisfaction of the group. There were a couple of persons there who were intended to look at the vulnerable groups beyond just including those specific facilities. But we do believe it is an issue that needs specific treatment in the realm of earthquakes, and so perhaps at another place, another time, once we're drafting the roadmap, please ensure that there's a stop, a point in it for vulnerable groups, including migrants. In terms of medium and long-term solution, if or when some of these facilities fail, how do you continue to operate? Again, brought within the realm of BCP, but deserving of special mention, your quick erect shelters, some kind of auto sheltering that you quickly assemble to at least allow the facility to continue its operations. The role of insurance, or group members felt that insurance had a place, but for some unknown reason, there's still a myth surrounding the cost of insurance, versus its usefulness. And so there's need to re-educate on the role of insurance. And we heard some costs that sounded very encouraging. And if they are in fact so, then certainly it has a place, especially for critical facilities. So that is something we certainly should look at. Also, another dimension to the critical facility is the same way you have the CRIF, designed mainly for continuity of government. Could you have a special product designed to support critical facilities?
in terms of local, national, and sectoral school safety program, that is something that definitely deserves, and it cascades from national, from sectoral, national, and down to local. Training of the personnel within the critical facilities themselves, because if the building standard doesn't stand, what is going to also make the difference is the capacity of the personnel to continue operations. So they must be trained, they must be seamless, they must know how to transition if they have or don't have the resource. Also retrofitting of the facilities, which is an obvious one. Almost there. I'm not going to go through the entire list of partners, but what was elaborated is that sometimes partnerships are viewed as a one-way relationship, in that what can I get from you? But it was certainly enforced that it ought to be a two-way relationship, because we're naming umbrella groups such as PSOG, and sometimes we think we need things from them, but sometimes we in turn can pass on something. They can then become advocates on our behalf for business continuity planning for their members and so on. Renewable energy. If another, talk about the interdependencies again. If power goes, water goes, how does a critical facility function? Is renewable energy an alternate to that? Oh, a very novel idea came out, and I heard it's going to be copyrighted. And it is a little beyond just critical facilities, but to include also residential units. What if the NHT was to tomorrow announce that we're providing special loans for homeowners to retrofit for seismic resilience? Wouldn't that be lovely? So that is something that certainly deserves some attention. I have one final case left to go. In terms of best practices, Mexico, the presentation yesterday, the takeaway from that is political will, the value of political will in crossing this seismic resilience hurdle. Digicel, a clear model of continuity planning. Indonesia, though not presented on yesterday, but it is something that we face, loss of land in the face of an earthquake, to tsunami, to landslides, to whatever. How do you deal with land tenure issues resulting from that kind of a scenario? Do we have a plan in place for that? You were a legitimate landowner before, now you no longer have land, and I need to be relocated, resettled. What happens? The procedures, SOPs, and so on for issues like those need to come into play. BVI, for example, the issue of warehouses, are they critical facilities? BVI's case showed that. I don't think it was presented on yesterday, but do we have sufficient warehouse capacity to deal with some of the relief that may be coming in? And so before, warehouse space may be adequate, but in the aftermath, is it? And so we need to bring them in the umbrella of critical facilities. And the use of technology, can't quite recall, Jackie, where this one came from, but certainly simulating the effects on critical facilities and not stopping there, but using it to inform your public education program. And I will stop there.
Sorry, two quick comments. I think in the housing sector, insurance is always seen as a little bit of a distraction in terms of safe building. I don't like to knock insurance. It's very nice, but people sometimes do one or the other. I think for critical facilities, though, I would much prefer to have them robust rather than insured, because insurance can take 6 months to come through. It's not really going to deal with the criticality of the thing. I think if I was a housing trust representative, I would say that we already have home improvement loans, and I'm sure that retrofitting can come under home improvement loans.
Okay. On the issue of insurance, because that did come up, I think one, there's still a misunderstanding about insurance, and my insurance counterparts has assured me that it is very possible that they can go on a public education drive about that. And secondly, the kind of insurance for critical facilities was akin to the CRIF, in that once you exceed, it's a trigger. And once that trigger, then there's a payout. So that should shorten the claim processing period.
And the assumptions about insurance coverage as maybe one of the pathways in this roadmap. Assumptions are being made about penetration of insurance in the society, and also how the insurance sector sees itself compared to what the public perception is. And I just like to point out that I think we need to flag insurance as a genuine issue, and to also point out that, to the best of my knowledge, the Jamaican insurance regulator has never been a part of the conversation about earthquake or hurricane risk, to the best of my knowledge. There is a dedicated insurance regulator as part of the government regulatory mechanism, and it seems to me that some of this conversation must engage that regulatory body. In some other jurisdictions, the insurance regulator plays a key role in making sure that these issues are properly aired and a balance struck between the public good and the need to regulate in terms of the fiscal issues which tend to dominate the Jamaican regulatory outlook. So I'm sticking my neck out here, but I really do believe we have an issue which needs an engagement. Yeah, there's another feedback comment here, yes?
Yes, I just kind of wanted a clarification in terms of what are critical facilities, because I didn't see, I know we have hospitals, fire stations and so on, but I didn't see anything that involved I was going to say the private sector, but involved more the community. Like, I mean, something critical in a disaster would be like the supermarkets or the pharmacies or local organizations that can provide some amount of relief while we wait on all the, planes and so on to come in. And I don't know if there is any provision for those.
To bring you up. I did have a little intervention with the group, and I pointed that we had tried to massage the heading of that group to include, I think, Vital and Lifeline, because some of those may not be critical. And again, this is building on some very good work that the Australians have done in looking at this issue. So they have expanded it to, in Jamaica there's something called Essential Services Law, and we tend to clump those as critical services. But the truth is we need another conversation about what is essential, critical, and vital, meaning some of the other things, a supply of food, supply of cash. And indeed, the Australians have brought the internet completely into their core area, which is rigidly enforced in terms of robustness and reliability because of the considerations of a modern society. And in Jamaica and in most of the Caribbean, the flow of remittances is indeed and in fact a vital lifeline facility for many, many people in this region. So it needs to be expanded, and of course things like tourism facility to regenerate economic and revenue flows. But it's an area where perhaps ODPEM or the PIJ need to jointly stimulate the conversation, because in many modern approaches to this subject, and I just picked the Australian because I happen to have some very good publications in the last years on the matter, people have expanded and drawn this distinction between essential, critical, vital, and that leads to some interesting recovery planning and synergies in all the things that the society needs to function in a fairly normal way. So we have flagged that, and I think we're going to have to find a way to adjust the roadmap to take that into account. But that conversation needs to be led by some of the agencies, and maybe PIG is a better core point, entry point than ODPEM, because that then looks at all of the flows Mr. Mason was referring to. stimulating implementation. And within the UN system, some of the better thinking of that is actually within the ILO, which looks at livelihood issues as a part of the quick recovery programming.
In terms of the roles and responsibilities, our group, we first of all looked at some of the gaps, and we looked at the technical work being done right now is quite in the preliminary stage, and of course not only follow-up is needed, but they think they are going to also, we're also looking at expansion of the network for data collection and more inputs into the hazard mapping process. That, of course, is being led by the Seismic Research Unit at the University of West Indies. We also thought that leadership, under leadership, the political champion, the Prime Minister and the appropriate ministers, we need to identify them, not only at the political level, but we also need to identify champions at the ministry level, at the community level, and also we need to do some sensitization of the political directorate critical issues relating to seismic and seismic preparedness. The discussion then, of course, centered around the recommendations from the report and the guiding questions that we had, and coming out of the discussions, we thought that there should be some sort of identification and development of a code for business continuity. And we think that that is a short to medium term activity. Of course, maybe going into the long term. And short term, we identified between 12 to 18 months. Medium term between 3 to 5 years, and long term anytime after that. We think that the role and responsibility would rest with the Bureau of Standards to look at how that is developed. In terms of other programs and projects that we see being infused into the roadmap is the private sector engagement in the discussion and follow-up actions, and possibly certification. And that is looking at the training needed, how we engage them, how we get feedback from them, how we even, include them in this kind of activity, a short to medium term time frame as well. And we think that the responsible agencies or persons would be the Master Builders Association, supported by the Jamaica Institute of Engineers, Planners and Architects, and the university. The development and, of course, to promote volunteer and leadership programs for the community, for community resilience and community building. This will start in the short-term period, and primary responsibility for that would be the Social Development Commission. Secondary would be the parish disaster, the parish development committees, and NGOs and the ODPEM. I'm just so happy that this was a group effort, and my group members are there to validate where I may go wrong. The second area that we looked at would be moved on. Right. Okay. South cooperation between universities to share best practices and other programs, and of course we looked at DOMREP, Puerto Rico, Chile. Examples of some that we would consider and that is a short to medium term time frame as well, with the primary responsibility being the Ministry of Education and the universities supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the PIOJ. The identification and, okay, in terms of capacity development, which was, I think, the second to last question. We looked at the identification and engagement of experts and actors from across all the sectors. And of course, this is a medium to long-term short activity. Responsible, we didn't get to identifying who should be responsible for that activity. So that is something that we will do, afterwards. But that is an area that we think we need to focus on in terms of our capacity building and development. And in terms of best practice, we want to examine the work and the practices of Japan, Turkey, Mexico, Chile, and California in the areas of planning, the building codes, coordination, and communication. A short to medium term, going into long term activity. And the agencies that will be responsible, roles and responsibilities would lie with NEPA, the Jamaica Institute of Engineers, NEPA for the planning, Jamaica Institute of Engineers, Architects and Planners for the building codes. The coordination would be ODPEM and communications, and of course all of this would also be supported by ODPEM. Now in terms of funding, which is another area, we thought that the Ministry of Finance should source funding, and this is, within the short to long-term period, because we'll always be sourcing funding. And we just wanted to make one point on the framework, because we were asked to just examine the framework to see if it was adequate and if we would have wanted to add any comments to the framework, and we thought it was okay. We agreed with the points that were mentioned, but we added one recommendation to look at the examination of interagency cooperation. And this interagency cooperation would also include the media. And the interagency cooperation should include with it the requisite protocols, standards, and procedures. So that would be one recommendation that we'd want to add to the framework. And in terms of coordination and follow-up, all of this will be coordinated through the Office of the Prime Minister and supported by the ODPEM. These will be recommendations that we'll put forward at the end of this for consideration and action.
And can I call upon, I believe it's Delmaris White and her group to present on the immediate and pressing issue of sensitization, public awareness, etc.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have members in my group who wanted to contribute orally, if I should say that, since we're the communicators. And so if you're at a desk with your microphone, please feel free to assist or guide me as I go along. I will start off by identifying the gaps already mentioned by the groups previously, as they went through communication gaps also. And so let's go to group one. The group one spoke about access to technology, and it's important in any situation. We're here looking at seismic risks, but as we look to other hazards, it's important to understand that if we do not have the technology, satellites, satellite phones, then we can't communicate. And we saw that happened in Haiti. And so the technology is good support, so they looked at that as a gap. Then group two looked at the public. They wanted the general public to not be the only identified type of public. In marketing, we talk about our various publics. And here for disaster communication, we say in ODPEM, we kind of defy the marketing rule in that we talk about general, every life counts. But how do we segment and dissect how we reach the public or these publics is important. And so Group 2 looked at not identifying just the general public, but to find out how we reach ministers and policymakers and persons in critical facilities and children and those most vulnerable and the elderly and all of that. And so Group 3 looked at social media, and it was good because we also looked at that as I go to our gaps. And it's important because here in Jamaica we have underground news. Can somebody confirm that for me? And so they've put a different spin on how we do with traditional communication, in that I no longer sit and listen to RJR and Power and Fame and the rest of it. I have my Facebook up, and I know that if there is a tsunami somewhere, I'm knowing it first via social media. So we want to know how we can use the Twitter, the text messaging, and all the other types of social media to ensure we get that information out as media practitioners. So Group 3 looked at social media and traditional media and how we can integrate them. Group 4, Michelle Edwards just finished. They included media in their discussion, and they found that they needed to examine how we treat with the protocols and the standards. In ODPEM and for the Disaster Act, there is an annex to the act that speaks to communication. This was developed by CARIMAC, and I think at the time Professor Agri Brown was leading that charge, and they have developed a standard that we use when we go operational. And so I'm not sure in terms of ratification for that, but how many of us in our agencies know that this document exists and how we treat with it? And so for us, that could be a gap. I'd like to turn your attention now to our board and to look now to the gaps that we looked at. As we would have it, we also looked at the plans and procedures. We believe that the individual stakeholders must be encouraged to take responsibility for developing their own plans and standard operational procedures. We believe that if we take the communication practice at the individual level, then we would be better able to communicate those information to everyone, I believe. Social media gives us an opportunity to speak individually, one-on-one. And so we believe that if we can encourage persons in the communities, in their various homes, to take responsibility in their offices, develop their own standard operational procedures, then that would be able to satisfy some of the missing elements. We also believe that if we looked at the medium to long-term activity, we have media, private sector, and civil society should advocate for legislation to be passed to facilitate best practice in disaster management. At the medium level, we believe that we need to encourage private sector, civil societies, because you know we have more different groups, and other persons to ensure that government make the decision to ratify how we legislate as it relates to communication practices. This would be at the local level, and this will be at the sectoral level. For the long-term actions, we believe also that media, private sector, civil society, government must establish mechanisms for working together to ensure the successful and efficient implementation of the regulations, policies, protocols, and procedures pertaining to disaster management. Some of the problems that we encounter is that a lot of times the information in the communication plan is not supported in the legislation. And so we would like to bridge that gap by ensuring that the individual with their standard operational procedures at the lower level in their communities, their social groups, by the time the legislation is passed, there is some symbiotic relationship between the community and the government. So these were short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions. In terms of critical partnership, we dissected them specifically because, as you know, we don't do mass media, mass public, and so we wanted to look at the citizens. Who are the citizens? The community-based organizations. We also dissected faith-based organizations. Zonal committee members, the parish disaster coordinators, has in their control members who they would have trained at the zonal level to be community members. We also have service clubs, adults and youth groups, whether it be the Girl Guides Association, Scout, or the Rotary Club, and any other club, the Kiwanis Club. We'd also dissected the groups, the community leaders, and we specifically under community leaders, identify teachers and social workers. In our society, we know that we have movers and shakers, and we have other persons politically affiliated, whether they be the dons or those persons in the community that command a lot of respect. Those would be some of the partners that we want to engage in a way that we can communicate through them, to send the message out regardless of what hazard that we want. How do we reach these persons? Mass media will not necessarily take care of all the community-based groups. We can't always guarantee that the traditional television and radio will reach them. And so we want to have face-to-face meetings, get into the communities and speak, whether it be through the awareness part of it, whether it be pre the actual hazard, whether it be during the hazard, recovery and post-hazard. We want to ensure that these persons are at the forefront of our minds. In regards to medium-term partners, media, we put media in there mass on the medium term because we feel now with social media that we'll be able to reach these persons. Medium term, media in particular, mass media, whether it be radio, print media, private sector, we looked at not just the Lascos and Grace Kennedys of the world, but also the small shop in the community. Yeah, they're private sector persons also. And so how do we reach those persons? And then we have civil society, whether it be the human rights group here, the Children Cry, CSJP, those are also partner agencies that we want to partner with. Government, parish coordinators, parish councillors, MPs, mayors, ministers, and the departments and agencies of the ministry, ODPEM, National Works Agency, National Solid Waste Management Authority, and they become critical partners. One of our previous group members explained to you that the partnership shouldn't just be a one-way activity. It must be that we are both benefiting from each other, and so the relationship is symbiotic. In terms of capacity development needs, communication is, simply put, that which we do and we do naturally because we speak well, most of us, and we can write letters. We use memos and emails and all kinds of other medium to communicate. And so because of that, a lot of times, traditionally, we think that we're really good at it until an event happens, and then we have to craft a press release, or we have to put an ad on air, or we have to get some information out to someone to move quickly. And then we recognize that communication is not as simple as we thought it was naturally. Communication is strategic. It is strategic because it has to be crafted in a way that is simple and it's easily understood. And I made note when Franklin spoke, and we couldn't decide whether we should use the word essential, critical, or vital. In a press release, if you use the wrong word, you may have the wrong group of people staying home. And so it's important that we understand that delivering that message is important. And a lot of times we take communication for granted because, as I said earlier, it's something we do naturally. In disaster management, it is strategic. In disaster management, it is sometimes guided or guarded, especially in the political arena, because sometimes there's some information that could prove to be detrimental to the population. And how do we filter that down so that individuals are told information that will protect them and not cause mass panic? And so that's something too we wanted to consider. In terms of capacity development, because communication is not as natural as we believe it is, we believe that training in proper communication technique, management, writing your press releases and putting the who, what, where, when, why, where it is relevant, we believe that training should be given to those persons who are charged with the responsibility for ensuring that communication is timely, strategic, and delivered in a manner that's understandable for most of us. And so for that reason, we broke down the audience once more. So we believe that education and training in specific hazards, we want for hurricanes, and we want for earthquakes, and we want for global issues, or whether it be cyber crimes, to be dealt with, because a lot of times the response is different. The information to the public is different. And so we need to know that an onset that's slow and one that will happen now, and then we have to deal with it afterwards, the communication that goes out is very different. So we want to train government officials and policymakers. And may I ask your permission to kindly acknowledge Minister Pickersgill as he joins us today. And so the policymakers will be trained, education and training for government officials and policymakers. when they understand what the needs are, heads of departments and agencies will also be trained. Civil servants or government workers, a lot of times our agencies are responsible for doing something that will ease the tension for those persons in our society, in our community. And so private sector and media, community leaders and community groups. Another thing we want to add, and this is in all fairness of training abilities, sometimes when you mix the groups in some training arena, the information is not as free-flowing and people are not as comfortable. So I wouldn't see me putting civil servants and man ministers in the same training arena. Do you agree? And for that reason, we have segmented it in that regard. And so we want to identify that these trainings will be continuous. They'll be ongoing because new hazards, new problems arise very frequently. And so when we talk about South-South cooperation, we've been at this forum for a day and a half, and we have learned from the various countries. And as one of my colleagues said, as we try to put the information together, Mexico and Haiti and Chile, the information they gave, the graphic photographs, all this is ways in which we communicate. It resonates with persons, and it is sometimes, especially when you are not familiar with that particular hazard. The pictures coming out of Haiti, I know for us in Jamaica, we have never had an earthquake in this 100-year, I should say, Franklin, you may correct me, that would have created that impact and image for us. And in seeing those images, we're able to really take the information seriously. And so the South-South cooperation is already happening, and so we want to build on that because we're saying that they share with us in terms of the hazards they are specifically hit by, and then we share with them the information that is relevant to hurricanes and those other hazards that we've had to deal with. And so I think that this symbiotic relationship is important. It is important because it allows us an opportunity to see and to have an insight into how we will move forward as we discuss this problem in terms of communication. I want to move now to this chart, and I wanted to take the opportunity to invite. You see how wonderful we are in communication? It's my final chart. I wanted to show you graphically how it is we want to bridge the social media technologies and the text messaging as we integrate communications with persons. A lot of times we leave out popular culture. As communicators, it's important because you can't reach teenagers if you're going to talk up. Give me something from your era, Barbara or something that sings. Barbara Streisand. Maybe the young people would not identify. They may identify with the voice. Yeah, and so I'm just saying, how do we treat with popular culture and how we treat with the information? Traditional media, radio and television is on its way out. Social media, of course, if you're tweeting, and you may be following. And I just want to say that for the OTPEM and Jamaica, during, it may be about 2 or 3 years ago, H1N1, we were able to bring on board Lime, who sent text messages for us in terms of tips of how to wash hands, and we are now trying to get Digicel, I hope Mr. Betancourt is still here, to engage us in that activity, because if we can use both of those companies to send the messages out, definitely we'll be in good stead. So as I wrap up, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that we have kind of demystified how it is that we consider ourselves experts when we're in our offices, but when it is time to do strategic communication, we need to ensure that we find the persons who are trained in that area to assist us with the messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delmaris. And as with the other presentations, do we have any need for any of the group to clarify anything else or for any other questions?
Our data, that's where we'd be using smartphones and so on, is that more robust than voice and SMS communication? It may be the way in which communication, but it still requires a hardware backbone, which is not necessarily what you use for communication after an event.
Thanks, David. It's a very valid and relevant question. Those of us who follow these events know that in the case of the Greater Hook earthquake of 2011, the Japanese are sufficiently disciplined that they, having received a warning on their cell phones, that is if you're in Tokyo, most Japanese then refrain from making voice calls because the preparation there tells them that tying up the voice channels takes away bandwidth. And so they voluntarily dropped voice calls and went all text. And this takes a lot of effort on the part of the society and the disaster managers and the commercial people who run the phone systems to get that kind of societal coherence where you recognize there is an event happening on its way to you, and you voluntarily avoid calling up all your friends and relatives, but switch the text. And that's the kind of high standard that we see in other societies that we need to think about. But that depends, of course, on robust architecture and backbone in order for it to run. And we certainly did hear something about how Digicel saw themselves in that context. Any other comments and feedback? The ministers, you're welcome, Minister Pickersgill. And no need to tell you that the minister is aware of the need for some of the cultural avenues, since on wearing his hat as the Minister in charge of climate change, he and I took part in an exercise about a year ago where we saw some of these cultural expressions on display and well received by very young people. We are trying to close this session. If you have no other comments on the point that I think the presentation is very coherent.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Franklin.
Sure. Okay.
Just as a follow-up on Dr. David Smith's comment, I don't know if our telecommunication providers are here, but what would you consider to be the usefulness of cloud computing in support to our needs or possible needs in the event of a disaster? I don't know if telecommunications persons are here or anyone could comment on that.
Any telecom specialists here? Go ahead. Yeah.
Even though my voice is a little bit loud, where everyone can hear me, but I probably need it for persons. What I'm saying is that you need the same infrastructural setup, because as Glaze was just saying earlier, that cloud computing, you're not hooked up to the cloud, but you need a IT backbone to do that. What it gives you, though, it gives you almost immediate data replication. So if you have set up where you have a offsite, a hot site that stores your data, if you should lose your data in an emergency, what you can do is remotely, easily bring up back your data. So like for all your GIS information that you would need to run your scenarios, you can easily pull back those if you have an offsite backup. So it runs on the same backbone, really.
Thanks for that intervention, and they just agree. What we have seen is cellular technology is very robust, and even if there are system failures, many of them can be very quickly corrected. But it has to be part of the plan if you have an extreme physical event like a very strong earthquake. And the disaster management system must give a high priority to the restoration of communication system, and it turns out especially the mobile and cellular systems. And in most of the extreme events we have had recently, the mobile systems have performed extremely well and have a limited breakdown. The major problem that we have seen across the mobile systems has been overuse. That is congestion due to everybody trying to call at the same time. And many of the systems have sophisticated tools for stripping away non-essential people, meaning the average member of the public, and allowing pre-selected emergency facilities, primary and exclusive use in some cases, of the surviving components of the system and surviving bandwidth, which means ODPEM, etc., need to have an understanding with Lyman, Digicel, etc., about their being given access to whatever part of the system survives, and those systems can only be worked out in advance. Professor Krimgold.
Just to qualify that enthusiasm, in recent events in the United States, we have seen extensive failure of cellular systems at exactly when they're most needed due to loss of electric power, single feed power support to isolated cell towers. This means that a really critical issue is ensuring independent power supply to remote cell towers in order that these systems continue to function. That's a very specific and critical point.
Thanks for that, Fred. As far as I know, the requirement, the standard for cell towers in Jamaica is that they must have at least one level of redundancy, and most of them, I gather, have 2 levels of redundancy. The problem we have had in cell towers in Jamaica after extreme events has been our inability to reach the towers with fuel resupply on the second day of operation on their own, which I think, as it turns out, has been because there's been no arrangement made with the road and air. In other words, if surviving helicopter services are limited, the cell towers at one time were not ranked among the people who had immediate and first access to helicopter services to refuel the cell towers. I think that's now been fixed. So we have already had that experience. I think we've fixed it. So some of those things have been fixed locally, but we do need to keep track of the performance of the mobile system in other extreme events. And coming out of Chile, New Zealand, and Japan, been some extremely interesting experiences, which the cell companies keep track of. I'm not sure if all the government agencies across the Caribbean keep in touch with the cell companies enough to understand the extent to which sophisticated adjustments in hardening the cell systems have been absorbed and can be of use to the governmental emergency management system, but that conversation is one that needs to be carried out and to include the spectrum management authorities. I made a gentle inquiry of ODPEM as to the extent to which they have engaged with the spectrum management body here, and I got the impression that the engagement is still not as deep as it probably could and should be. And may I make the other point that the remarks I made about the engagement of other regulatory bodies, the Office of Utility Regulation, to set standards for the utilities in terms of deep redundancy, deep and multi-layered redundancy. Until recently, for instance, the ministry, the Water Authority in Jamaica was not required to have backup energy facilities at every wellhead. I think we have now begun to correct that after some recent experiences. But those are the kinds of things that utility regulators in other jurisdictions are setting up, and the Australians actually have a document setting out what they expect of the utility regulator in terms of requiring of them regular assessments of the type we discussed in the group dealing with critical facilities, but which, to my understanding, the Jamaican utility regulator has not yet made a standard. So your utility regulator has vast powers, reserve powers, which perhaps the emergency management authorities in the Caribbean need to explore rather than thinking it's their responsibility to force seismic assessments and even to borrow people from Martinique to tell a utility in Jamaica full of engineers how to do an engineering assessment. So there's some synergies we could look at.
Good afternoon. My name is Vivian Davis Campbell. While we're speaking on communication and we're talking about mobile service, cellular service, I noticed that we haven't spoken about the amateur radio system as well as VH radios and so on, which is, we know, is a very reliable system to use when all those means of communication has failed or failed. So we should be looking at doing that. I have gotten some training through ODPEM and the Parish Council, St. Catherine Parish Council, where they are training persons in using these mediums, these form of communication system, so that we can have something to rely on if our other popular communication system fails. So that's an area that we need to now start advocating to get up and running for other agencies and government service.
Thanks for that comment, and let me also point out that indeed and in fact, good old robust, raw VHF power does cover an area like Kingston very well. You do not need any repeater if you have strong VHF. You have a 20-watt VHF receiver running in Kingston. You can cover the corporate area probably 95%. And indeed and in fact, the time of the establishment of ODP, that was the backbone of the system, that we could talk directly to fire, police, all the headquarters with no repeater support, out of wherever ODP choose to set up its EOC. Because, as I said, literally raw VHF power can cover from Kingston to Maypen without any repeater backup required. The fact of the matter is, to some extent, we have brought in some more sophisticated and less robust technology, but we do need to, as the colleague from Chile pointed out, we need to plan in depth and ensure that we don't forget that there are always system problems, and the immediate need, communication-wise, is to ensure that all the pieces that survive can be brought together in some way. And I trust that the scenario development which Professor Mitchell and others are supplying us with covers all the possibilities. Towers on cellular roofs being impacted by the failure of the roof, etc., etc. The backbone systems on the high points which are used for some of the towers being affected by other kinds of problems. Since yesterday, we have had the news from the seismic specialists about the extent to which the plates around Jamaica are in a state of stress. You have had a sharing, very open sharing of some of the new knowledge and what we need to focus it a bit more so we can build better scenarios. And you have also heard from our colleagues from several neighboring countries, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Chile, on their experiences and how they have addressed the matter of coping. And you had an excellent presentation from our colleague from Japan to indicate the extent to which Japanese society has made itself a disaster-ready society, and how they dealt with the challenges they've had. The presentations reflect that the groups have absorbed the information, that some very structured ideas about short and medium-term action has been put forward, and I just want to confirm that a roadmap will be pulled together so we can prioritize some action. This is very timely because, as you've heard, ODPEM will be marking next week their own week of awareness actions, and I think it's an excellent platform for them to go into that week with. It's now just up to me to assure you this will be undertaken. Thank all the participant presenters and return you to Elsie, who's going to lead us through the closing session.
Thank you very much, Franklin. At this point, I would like to welcome Minister Robert Pickersgill and Dr. Kashyap. I would also like to welcome the Chief Technical Director of the Ministry of Environment, Awal Khan, and Mr. Richard Thompson from ODPEM. I would also like at this point to request Honorable Minister Pickersgill and Dr. Kashyap to please come to the panel table, please. As was presented to you just now and over the course of the forum, several key issues were debated and a lot of good recommendations were made. Now the challenges will be when and how and whether these recommendations will be implemented. So they can only be implemented by ensuring that all sectors, everybody, all key stakeholders participate, are aware and involved. Resource mobilization will also be a critical challenge that we have to overcome. So we all have a role to play. The government, for example, has a vital role to play in ensuring that seismic risk preparedness becomes a reality in Jamaica. The international community as a whole, the private sector, all of us have an equally important role in ensuring that the roadmap that Franklin just mentioned to you a while ago is finalized and implemented. And it is in this context that I'm asking kindly Dr. Arun Kashyap to present his closing remarks to you.
Thank you, Elsie. On Honorable Robert Pickersgill, Minister of Environment, Water, Land and Climate Change, Mr. Richard Thompson, Acting Director General of ODPAM, all colleagues here, experts, diplomatic community, Your Excellency Ambassador of Argentina, all experts, all visitors who are here, good afternoon to you. And I am really happy that we had this meeting, that having sat in the last session of this, the 1.5-day consultation, I could see and sense the richness of the discussion, the commitment of all of you, and your ideas that have come across. You know, couple of things, and we are going to put that all together in a document. We do plan to have a roadmap for action, something that would identify responsibilities, which will also have benchmarks of progress and a timeline. And I'll come back to what we as the UN system and UNDP would do in that process. A couple of things that what I heard from all of you. One was, during the panel discussions, there was talk about the need for champions. Champions in the government leadership. And we are delighted that, you know, we started with one champion when we started our meeting yesterday. That was Honorable Minister Arscott. And we now at the closing session have our second champion, Honorable Minister Pickersgill. They are committed. They have shown their commitment right from the very time we started this initiative to advance and advocate greater knowledge, greater information on what we need to do. They understand, and I'm maybe, you know, taking the liberty of speaking on their behalf. I know they will also, like Minister Arscott, Minister Pickersgill will express his commitment on how we are going to move forward in advancing this particular agenda. The objectives we started with were very clear, that at one level, we need to understand what are the risks that are facing Jamaica. That given the information that and knowledge base that all of you bring to this, that you gave us a wonderful idea of the magnitude of risks, the urgency of the action that's required, and including right from critical infrastructure and the next steps where we are going from here. We also wanted to learn from good practices from our neighboring countries. We are a part of Latin America and the Caribbean region, so it's not only we have the expertise of the Caribbean countries, we also have the expertise that's available from our Latin American partners. And in addition, we also reached out to Japan this time to see what they could also share with us, because they are in terms of, I would say, creme de la creme of disaster management expertise. And a lot of those experiences have been shared, and the message that has come across very clearly, that something what we need to do as a starting point is, as I saw in one of the notes, that was preparedness, preparedness, preparedness. That we need to be prepared, because we have seen if we are not prepared, the magnitude of losses is way beyond control. The other thing that listening to all of you during the panel discussion, something that came very clearly to me, that it is extremely important that in that preparedness, we have our capacities at the human level, at the institutional level, but also at the system-wide level. And that is, the system-wide level comes through partnerships. Partnerships become extremely important. And then we know that we are not alone. That whatever we are doing here, we can always reach out to partners, other experts, because as we gather equipment, as we gather all these knowledge bases and capacities, during disasters, my experience has been something always does not work. It falls through the cracks where you have to reach out to others and you need support for that. And that becomes extremely important. So I cannot overemphasize the whole concept of partnerships, and particularly partnerships that come from the private sector. Not only from the private sector, but also from the civil society. We had discussion on insurance. And we also talked about the business continuity plans. Business continuity plan is something that the United Nations system has put into practice. We've been doing it for a long time, and all agencies have, in terms of our communication lines, business continuity plan, and where we go from there. And private sector does it very well. Otherwise, even disasters like the volcano in Iceland would have thrown their supply chains totally out of link, but they were able to manage those things. So those are some of the things that bring to us, and irrespective of what insurance, the amount of money that comes in, every penny counts. So even if it is 15%, 30%, it is a good starting point for what we do. In all these, what we also find is the whole issue of commitment, which we talked about from the championship and the commitment of the government, but it is commitment of all partners and all citizens, including all development partners. That's why we are here, and we totally are committed to this process. One of the things that I do wish to mention, that in all these processes, we have defined processes and there are informal processes. Now, informal processes is, which I heard yesterday from some of my Chilean colleagues, they say, you know, when the earthquake happened, there were households which were not that much affected, but they were going around with goods and services, how they could help people who needed assistance. No one organized that. That was the total volunteerism that comes as a matter of when you find your citizens, your other friends and others need that help. So what I would like to, rather than taking more time, I would like to have Minister Pickersgill also say something, that from the perspective of United Nations, all I would like to say is that it's a wonderful beginning we have had with our partnership with ORPEM, with Government of Jamaica's commitment. We are confident that we can move this process forward. ORPEM has already achieved a lot of progress in what they're doing in early simulation and looking at critical facilities. Now the challenge for us is how we're going to build upon this momentum and take it across, and in a manner which is transparent, which is participatory, and which has certain level of accountability, which are all the precepts of good governance. At the level of the UN, we are committed to continue to bring in the best expertise, best advice, and making sure that we are able to get the various partners together. So we have a strategy that not only builds upon resource mobilization at the time when it's required, but also working very closely with all different development partners. You know, I know Red Cross, from their presentation, they've done some excellent work on the legal side, on the relief and recovery side. How are we going to build upon all that and bring it in a manner that we are there up to meet the challenge whenever that would be required. With that, once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here, sparing your time and being with us and sharing all this knowledge. And we will certainly make sure that in a very timely manner you're able to see your work being translated into an action plan, which we will keep you abreast of the progress in a consistent manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kashyap. A key actor in seismic risk preparedness, of course, is ORPEM, as the government agency directly involved in emergency management. So at this point, I'm inviting Mr. Richard Thompson to kindly share his a few closing thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Elsie. Honorable Minister Pickersgill, Dr. Arun Kashyap, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's still good afternoon. It is good afternoon. And it is, I think after speaking after Dr. Kashyap, it leaves me nothing else to say but thank you very much. but it is quite rewarding to have been here and to listen to the discussions and to gain further experience from what we have done for the past 2 days. In my opening remarks, I did say that seismic events are the most, if not, well, the highest impacting hazard that can happen on any country. And it is good that we have all turned out and we have all engaged ourselves in the discussions. The impact from seismic event is significant, and it can devastate any country coming out of the Haiti experience, coming out of what happened in Indonesia. And this forum has really placed us on the path to better understanding the work that we have to do and to grow in terms of our seismic readiness and our seismic preparedness. And it is good to see that we have Minister Pickersgill with us, my minister, who is always at our event and is always supporting the work of the ODPEM, was here with us. So it gives us hope, Minister, that as government agencies, we have the total support of the political directorate in what we're doing. So thank you very much for the time that you have taken to come and sit with us and to engage in the discussions. I thank the participants from overseas. It is quite fitting when you can put out the request and you get individuals coming all the way from Chile and Mexico and all these places. It shows that there is great interest in what we're doing, and that there is some degree of commonality in terms of the hazards that affect us. We also sent a request to Turkey, but I think probably the request went a little bit late. But it would have been good to have them here to sit and engage in the discussions. And my hope is that this is the start of something greater. And it will not only result in discussions, but it will result in actions. Because the greatest thing in what we're doing is not to engage in talk shops, but ensure that at the end of the day, there is concrete establishment and implementation of what we want to achieve. So I will not take up much more of the minister's time. I know that he's very busy. So I will say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope that we will be able to give you the tapes of the symposium very soon, and we'll be able to go deeper in terms of our plan preparation, our simulation exercises, and our overall state of readiness as it relates to seismic events. So thank you very much.
In this, the fact that the international community has been present for the 1.5 days and has also helped to bring experts here showed that they're also supportive in this endeavor. But without the government full commitment and support, none of this will happen. Yesterday, Minister Oscott has also pledged his full support to this process. Now, I would like to ask Honorable Minister Pickersgill, Minister of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate Change, to kindly share his remarks with us.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and Mr. Thompson. Since I didn't know how much time I had, I don't know how much time you took. I would like to proffer as my own previous salutations that have been given, but perhaps I would be remiss if I did not refer to Mr. Thompson, the distinguished ambassador, and Mr. Franklin MacDonald, the overseas participants representing the international community, and of course my good friend Dr. Aaron Kashap. You must forgive me if I am repetitive, but if it turns out to be, it's really for the sake of emphasis. Because the little that I've heard so far, I would suggest that what I have prepared could come across as repetitive. But let me start by wishing everyone a peaceful, productive, and prosperous new year. I know that resolutions are the norm at the beginning of each new year. But to those persons who did not make any resolutions this year, because you're still working on the ones from as far back as the year 2000, I say, may all your troubles last as long as your New Year's resolutions. I'm very pleased to have been invited to address the closing ceremony of this very timely and very critical Seismic Risk Forum, which I know coincides with Earthquake Awareness Month. I must commend the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, ODPEN, for planning and hosting this event. And of course, I mentioned already my good friend, Dr. Aaron. I must also thank the local, regional, and international presenters and participants for their input and involvement in this forum. In fact, we're just coming from a press conference we had about drought and our ability these days to predict drought and weather conditions in Jamaica in a much better way than we were accustomed to. As the Minister with responsibility for the environment and as the Member of Parliament for Northwest St. Catherine, and usually when I mention that I get a little applause, but this forum was particularly welcome. As we all know, St. Catherine is one of the most vulnerable parishes to natural hazards, including earthquakes and tsunami. It is no secret that Jamaica lies in earthquake zone 3, and here I go repeating what is obvious to you experts, and that we have 3 fault zones: the Crawl River Ram, the Wagwater, and the Enriquillo Planting Garden. As such, there is a high probability of major damage from magnitude 6 to 7 earthquakes. Last year, geophysics professor Eric Calles of Purdue University made headlines when he noted that the threat of a magnitude of 7 or 7.5 earthquake is very real based on the area's history and active seismic activity. You must remember that it was a 7-degree magnitude earthquake that struck our sister nation, Haiti, on January 12, 2010. And as we all know, that earthquake resulted in over 230,000 deaths and several million people homeless. We have suffered not too dissimilar fates from earthquakes in the past. We know about 07, Kingston was destroyed by a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, and there were some 1,000 deaths. And researchers from the University of the West Indies have noted that should an earthquake of similar magnitude occur now, Jamaica could suffer losses amounting to some 6.5 billion Jamaican dollars. That estimate sounds a little conservative to me. Our scientists say that Jamaica has about 200 earthquakes every year, although most of them are minor, with magnitudes of less than 4. In magnitude, less than 4. What this means is that our preparedness and alert levels must be consistently high. It goes without saying, therefore, that we should be familiar with our drills and plans for schools, offices, and, of course, our homes. Earthquakes remain one of the most frightening, as we just heard from Mr. Thompson. Natural disasters, mainly because of their unpredictability and the suddenness with which they strike. We have knowledge about the approach of a tropical storm or hurricane from its formation, and we can track its development and passage, but predictions of when an earthquake will occur and its likely magnitude remain largely elusive. Earthquakes sometimes bring another threat. In recent years, many of our citizens have become familiar with the term tsunami. As I understand it, the literal translation of tsunami from Japanese to English is, quote, harbor wave, end of quote, which to me is a deceptively mild term for such a devastating force. Madam Chairperson, I can't forget the movie Earthquake, and I've watched that movie several times, and I think it really indicates what an earthquake can do. The images coming out of Indonesia on that fateful Boxing Day in 2004, when a devastating tsunami struck following a 9.3 magnitude earthquake on the seabed, are etched indelibly, certainly in my mind. Seismologists have noted that the energy released by that tsunami was 1,500 times stronger than the energy released by the atomic bomb that devastated Hiroshima in World War II. More recently, in March 2011, Japan was hit by a 9.0 magnitude that triggered a deadly 23-foot tsunami in the north of the country. What is particularly frightening is that following the devastating earthquake in Haiti, reports from National Geographic noted that a number of tsunamis were produced with waves averaging up to 3 meters or 10 feet in height. This happened quite near to us here in Jamaica, so we need not deceive ourselves into thinking that it cannot happen to us. As a small island developing state, located within a seismically active area, we cannot underestimate the importance of emergency planning, and I heard some of it here just now, especially since we will not have advanced alerts or opportunities to double-check our plans. In my capacity as the minister with responsibility for climate change, I've often said that with climate change we must change. We need to expand that slogan to include earthquake preparedness as well. Earthquakes have specific implications for those of us involved in the planning and development process. During the mere fraction of a minute that earthquakes may strike, many casualties may occur, millions of dollars in property lost, and vital infrastructure as well as delivery systems disrupted. And we heard much about that just now. You will have noted in particular that our coastal plains have been extensively developed. Indeed, most of our urban centers and economic zones as well as our population are located near our natural harbors and along our flat coastal areas. Needless to say, the potential for widespread damage and loss of life in the course of an earthquake or tsunami is alarming. What is even more frightening is that the Jamaica Institution of Engineers has noted that a large percentage, some 70% of our buildings are informally built without professional inputs, and their designs were not submitted for an evaluation of code compliance. In a presentation in 2010, Mr. Noel Da Costa of the Jamaica Institute of Engineers stated that, and here again I quote, 40 to 70% of buildings in Kingston are expected to collapse under a major seismic event, end of quote. We all know that the Ministry of Local Government is working on revising the Building Act to provide a modern legal framework for the effective regulation and management of buildings and building-related activity. Efforts are also underway by my ministry to prepare new development orders which prescribe the type of development which may take place and require the grant of planning permission in the area where the orders are applicable. Where outdated orders exist, we will be modernizing and updating these plans to move us closer to realizing the National Spatial Plan, the NSP. These regulations will give teeth to the development planning process and ensure safety in the built environment and the promotion of sustainable development. However, we also have a major challenge with informal settlements as well as a number of inner city communities plagued by urban blight. Studies have revealed that there are over 500 informal or spontaneous settlements island-wide. Some of these have resulted from unplanned development, lack of enforcement, or in many instances a trend of conversion to transition areas without the necessary corrective actions to deal with the phenomena of unplanned growth, unplanned development, and inadequate enforcement. More so inadequate enforcement. We have also unfortunately identified a number of inner city communities that are plagued by urban blight. For the residents of these communities who do not have the foresight and capability to anticipate the issues and problems associated with earthquake hazard mitigation, the consequences are not only predictable but tragic. The fragility of these areas and the resulting negative economic impacts on programs for national development are potentially staggering. Over time, they have become more and more vulnerable to the destructive forces of natural hazards and pose threats to the quality of the environment. Unfortunately, many of our informal settlements have been constructed on land captured in our near hazard zone prone areas such as river banks or the banks of rivers, gullies, and along shorelines. It is my belief that we will have to move quickly to enact the no-build zone legislation prohibiting persons from building in hazard-prone areas. The experience we have in Jamaica, is that even when we relocate these people at a cost, they tend to go back, which is really quite something. In the meantime, we must take these considerations on board as part of any seismic risk reduction measures we undertake, as quite often it is the poorest and most vulnerable in society who are most affected. The poorest and most vulnerable in our society who are most affected. This socioeconomic group is often the last to be informed, the last to respond to threats from natural disasters and hazards, and are very often the last to recover from disasters, indeed, if ever. I have noted the several expected outcomes of your forum. And while they are all commendable, I must say that I would like to see a special focus on and special plans made for this group in terms of raising awareness and improving preparedness not only to earthquakes but to all natural hazards. Ladies and gentlemen, a significant concern regarding seismic risk is the capacity of key elements in the built environment and urban delivery systems to maintain or regain full operational and functional capacities during and after earthquakes. Within this context, policy, and I did hear your comment on that, within this context, policy actions taken by government officials, developers, urban planners, and insurers have extremely important roles to play in assuming responsibility for seismic risk reduction. It is my hope that this forum has provided all of you, participants, planners, and stakeholders alike, with the necessary exchange of experience, best practices, and invaluable information to achieve the objective of this forum, which was, and I quote, to raise awareness on the seismic risk to which Jamaica is exposed and to seek commitment and general consensus at various levels on a roadmap and plan of action for addressing seismic risk, end of quote. The reduction of risks from natural hazards is crucial to the process of achieving sustainable development, as well as to the process of making Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business, which is the overarching Vision 2030 National Development Goal. In closing, it is my hope that armed with the knowledge that you have gained at this forum, you will now be able to meet the logistical and tactical challenges inherent in raising awareness about and improving the preparation for earthquakes in your spheres of operation, so that in the end we can honestly say that we did everything possible to save our most important assets, the lives of our citizens. And Dr. Aaron, I look forward to what you describe as the roadmap for action. And I think it was said, and when and how it will be implemented. I wish for you all a happy, healthy, and climate-friendly 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your inspiring words and for reaffirming your commitment in this very important process. Now, before I close, I would like to remind you all of the expected outcome of this forum, which is quickly to have a sensitized government that's ready and able to take appropriate action in case of an earthquake, to make sure that we have key stakeholders engaged in the process, to have South-South and triangular partnership established for a coherent approach for the seismic risk preparedness, and to make sure that the population of Jamaica as a whole is mobilized and aware of this possibility. I hope that most of this has been achieved through this forum. But I would also like to take the opportunity to really thank everyone who has been who has been involved in this, who has made this possible. In particular, the embassy friends who have helped us, who have shared their experts with us. They've traveled from Chile, Mexico, from Haiti and DR as well. We would also like to thank the Japanese embassy as well for having an expert present to us, and all the local, regional, and international experts who have come and who have shared their experience and lessons learned over the past day and a half. I'd also like to thank our colleagues from ADPEM and UNDP. We've worked hard to make this happen for the past 3 months. And lastly, but not least, Mr. Franklin McDonald, who is the technical advisor to this forum, without whom this would never have happened. Thank you very much, Franklin. But I would also like to continue counting on everyone's support as we are developing this roadmap, and as we want to make sure that it's implemented. Your full involvement and continued engagement is very well needed. You have made this become a bit clearer after this forum, and we hope that it's going to become even clearer as you continue to work with us on that. And we will certainly need your continued engagement to implement a clear and targeted roadmap. Thank you again, and have a prosperous and blessed new year. Thank you. The session is considered closed.